We're live.
Good morning, everybody, or early afternoon, depending where you are, or tomorrow. We are Cristina and Sara from One Woman Shop. This is our weekly show that we like to call The Hot Seat, where we discuss different topics that come up for solopreneurs, and specifically that we see amongst our One Woman Shops. And for those of you that aren't familiar, One Woman Shop is a resource hub and community for female solo business owners.
You make me laugh every time we're doing the intros.
Because I'm terrible and I just kind of talk. Yeah. Thanks.
No, I love it. I love it.
I'll start taking notes.
They probably think of it as today in Australia. They probably don't think of it as tomorrow. That's an interesting thought experiment.
Whoa. Mind blown.
All right. We're a little weird today. Always.
Yes.
This topic is great.
Okay, so speaking of that, I will introduce the topic and then let Cristina take it away because I am putting Cristina in the hot seat today. So the topic that we're going to talk about, it's what we're referring to is acting in accordance with what you say you want. I'm going to throw a link in the chat there to a recent blog post that Cristina wrote for One Woman Shop. So Cristina, with that in mind, will you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by this?
Yes, I would love to. So every single post basically that I write on One Woman Shop comes out of just multiple conversations. It's never one conversation. I see this, like Sara said, with our community. I see it with conversations with Sara. I see it with conversations with my family and friends. And then I'm like, okay, there's a theme here. This has to be a blog post, which I totally described that entire process in the post. So I said it's like the Matrix, but with words instead of numbers. It's just like, and so basically, this whole concept is that I see in my life, I do it, other people do it. We say we want something and we don't actually act in accordance with that thing we say, we claim that we want. And so that's why the post is not called acting in accordance with what you want. It's what you say you want, because maybe you want it and maybe you don't actually want it. And so we can kind of dive a little bit more into that process of figuring out if this is something that you actually want. But I think it's important to us because we don't want to waste our time talking about a bunch of things that we supposedly want to do, because then we're just going to be thinking about this future thing, not actually making moves. So it's never going to actually happen. So that's why it's important.
Yes. Okay. So that's an awesome overview. And I like that we're going to dive deeper into some aspects. But before we get too far, I'm curious if there was a certain circumstance that you found yourself in, or that you saw perhaps with your business partner or any one of our One Woman Shops that kind of alerted you that this is actually like kind of a pervasive problem, that we don't act in accordance with what we say we want. Was there something that, because I know that you often, identify patterns, so it comes up more than once, right. But was there something that really launched the whole thought process around it?
Yeah, so there's one very specific example that happens often. So I live in Guatemala, and before I got a house in Guatemala, I was backpacking through Central America. I put all my stuff in storage. I took my half of One Woman Shop on the road, other half's in New York, and just set out on this pretty amazing kind of digital nomad travel adventure. I mean, it's been incredible, and there's been obviously hard times, but it's overall been an amazing experience. So when I post about it, it sounds amazing, and it is. So if I post about it on Facebook, I'm like, the obnoxious traveler statuses. Like I'll put up a picture of my terrace and me eating lunch up there and the view of all the volcanoes. And then I used the hashtag not so humble brag. I'm cool like that. But so that's a perfect example of something that's going on in my life. And I get messages from people all the time saying, wow, that's so incredibly cool. Your life looks so exciting. That, I want to do that. And I'm like, first of all, it's not actually that exciting. Like I go to the same coffee shop every day. It's great, but it's not super thrilling. But so the disconnect is people message me all the time. They're like, I want to do it. How do I do it? I give them all this advice and no one actually does it. Maybe like 1% of people actually follow through and become a digital nomad, which again is fine. I don't care if you become a digital nomad or not. It's whether you actually want to do it or whether you're kind of trapped in this jealousy that's not real jealousy because you don't actually want that thing.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So we can definitely get further into how you would say, you know, what you would say to somebody in that situation to help them determine if this is just like this ideal lifestyle that's out there for them. And they're like, wow, that seems really nice.
Right.
I want that. Or if it's actually, this is what I want. This is the only way I can see myself going. And so I need to make this happen. But before we get even further into that, I'm wondering, I know this theory is actually rooted further in research, and you come across a lot of this because of, I think, your sister. So can you tell us a little bit more about where this whole theory comes from?
So I have a lot of conversations with both my mom and my sister. And so my mom teaches ESL and my sister is a therapist for kids with autism. And we always notice these very common threads because between, you know, our coaching and then their work, because it's all human behavior. Teaching is human behavior. And I'm like, my joke is I'm like, your 5-year-old autistic children are like, it sounds terrible, but like, I mean, it's the same basic principles of behavior that we use in coaching every day, or that I use with myself. And so this is from ACT, which is a type of therapy. It's called acceptance and commitment. And basically, I don't want to totally butcher how exactly it works, but it's basically aligning, again, what you want with your actions, and recognizing this very important part in the middle, which is that sometimes there's a barrier. And so it's not always just, I want to become a digital nomad, therefore I'm going to become a digital nomad. Sometimes it's, I want to become a digital nomad, however, my parents are both really sick and I need to take care of them. And so that's kind of a barrier in between. Or I want to make speaking engagements a part of my solo business. But the big barrier in between is I am scared shitless of public speaking. And so you can't really get to the next step without first addressing that barrier. But so, yeah, it's a very interesting kind of therapy. And it's very rooted also in mindfulness, which is awesome because we're talking a lot about solopreneur sanity and meditation and mindfulness. And we have some awesome posts about that on the site. So, but if you're interested in ACT, it's just a quick Google search for acceptance and commitment.
Yeah, so I think that's it's really interesting that looking at it as this is really just back to common human nature. And so we're not sharing this to say, you know, if you aren't acting in accordance with what you say you want, you should beat yourself up about it. We're sharing this because so often we do it and we just don't realize it. So what would you say to somebody like the people that reach out to you like, oh, how'd you become a digital nomad? That sounds so great. I want to do it. What's the first thing you would say to them to kind of trigger the thought of, is this really something that you want?
Oh,
besides saying, is this really something?
Here's a link to my post that I just wrote and then a video we did about it. Now, that is a really good question. And gosh, it's a really tough question. I think that basically, I guess I'm going to take the easy way out and say it's not one thing I would ask. It's kind of a series of questions of like, I don't know. You know what? I'm just going to throw it back at you. How would you get at somebody and be like, do you actually want this, without being like, I barely know you. You just contacted me on Facebook. Now I'm going to interrogate you about what you really desire in your life.
nice little maneuver.
I'm just going to sip my tea.
Well, you know, so I'm thinking somebody reaches out to you about becoming a digital nomad, and you don't necessarily want to respond and say, well, It's not all sunshine and rainbows. There's this, and this that you have to consider. So if it's really something that you want, I'd be happy to talk to you more about those things, because it's not about instilling fear in them, and it's not about crushing dreams. But I think the question is, and you know, maybe it's not something you can say to somebody that you don't really know, but when we have coaching clients come to us where we're pretty far invested in their businesses and we know where they've been and where they're going, it's kind of easier to pull back and say, almost like, you know, one of our favorite things is like, well, if we asked you to give that up tomorrow, how would you feel about that? This is kind of the opposite, because it's something that you haven't necessarily started yet. So it's almost like, just it's about giving them that pause so that they have the room to think like, wait a minute, I'm just so far already thinking in the future that this is going to happen. I haven't actually thought about whether this is something I really want. So making the space for that. And I'm not sure what the exact question is, but it's almost just like that feeling of playing the devil's advocate.
Well, and I also think this might be a little bit off topic, but I think that it's really important. Like, deciding to put all your stuff in storage and move abroad is a huge decision. I didn't do that. I decided to take a 3-month trip. And to me, 3 months was so incredibly intimidating. And now it's been about a year and 3 months. And so I think talking, if you're in a coaching position or if you're talking to your friends or family, talking through the intermediate steps that you can take that are much less intimidating, I think is a really important half move. So another example, going back to the speaking engagements, if somebody wants to do speaking engagements in their business, but they're not getting started, you always talk about this, choose the next best step. So choosing the next best step could be you contact your local Rotary Club and you ask them if you can come chat with them for a few minutes. Or maybe the next best step is you set up a webinar, because maybe that's slightly less intimidating because you're not in front of people live or in person. So I think definitely choosing those next best steps to kind of get you closer and closer to the point that you want to be at without having to deal all at once with all of the fear or with with all the emotions that are holding you back. But so, yeah, go ahead.
Right. And going back to how you mentioned barriers that might be in the way, it's almost like those barriers will give you that pause you need, because when you have to face those barriers, you really do have to ask yourself, is it worth the time I'm going to invest here? Is it worth the money I'm going to invest? Is it worth giving up something else in order to do this? Obviously, you had to give stuff up in order to pack up and move to Central America. So I think naturally those barriers are going to inspire that question of, is this really something
is this worth it to me? We're reading Essentialism, and he talks a lot about trade-offs. And so there are absolutely trade-offs in every decision you make. But in my example of deciding to live abroad, the trade-off is I'm not as close to friends and family. My joke is that my trade-off is I don't get to use my Starbucks card, so I'm losing my gold status. So I'm pretty upset about that.
But
that's actually the number one trade-off.
That's a sacrifice.
Sorry, and there's safety as a trade-off, and there's earthquakes as a trade-off. So there's a lot of things. But I wanted to get into one of the questions you asked me right before we got on the call was, what is stopping people? Why aren't people acting in accordance with what they say they want? I'm trying to use the tagline as much as possible to make sure we bring it back.
Yeah, and specifically, my question is rooted around solopreneurs in their businesses. What makes them say they want something but not necessarily or not act
I have a lot of different reasons, and I think that it's important to distinguish what people are saying versus what they might be feeling but aren't able to articulate. So my example, I was in the bathroom, getting ready for this blab, and I was just thinking, with my hair, I was just thinking, weird places you think. And I was like, what? I think a lot of people, if they say they want to do something and they're like, yeah, I really want to be doing this thing, what's holding me back? I think a lot of people's first reaction is going to be time. And then I'm like, okay, well, is it actually time or is it priorities? And this is, again, something we talk about a lot in Solopreneur Sanity, is like really choosing your priorities. But to me, there's that distinction between, okay, well, I can claim it's this thing, but if I'm being honest with myself, which is another thing we love to say, if I'm being honest with myself, what is it actually? Is it actually fear? And like, if you've read Big Magic, you'll say, Elizabeth Gilbert says fear is the root of everything. But in your perspective, what are some things that might hold people back from acting in accordance with what they say they want?
Yeah, fear is the biggest thing. That's precisely would have been my first answer. And I think it's because it's easy to say you want something. It's harder to actually act in accordance with that. And I know we're just kind of repeating that, but that's seriously it. another big thing I think, and this kind of relates to fear, is doubt. So self-doubt, in particular when it comes to solopreneurs. So, I really want this, but I doubt that I can make it happen. And that again goes back to fear. I'm afraid of failing. So I shouldn't even try, or I'm just going to keep talking about it and not actually put myself out there. So I think those are the biggest things I see amongst solopreneurs, but time.
Well, I experienced a lot of that kind of doubt and fear when I was debating whether to take my 3-month trip. And the thing that I thought over and over is, if I'm unhappy here, that means I am just going to be unhappy no matter where I go. And it's easier to stay here where I know I'm unhappy than to go out, venture out into the world and realize, no, I'm just unhappy. And spoiler alert, I'm not just unhappy. Like, I was really situationally unhappy. And so, but it's that huge fear and that huge, like, I don't know if there's anything better on the other side. And then in addition, I think a huge thing that we experience related to life and solopreneurship and social media is the whole comparison trap. So I think that because we're all so plugged into each other's lives, and usually the best aspects of each other's lives, it's so easy to say that thing that person's doing is what I want to be doing. It's easy. It's perfect. It's, all these things that fall into the comparison trap. And then you're in that situation. You're like, oh, okay, now I actually have to deal with the reality of it, which is not what I saw online.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's very easy, but it's also remembering that there's so many reminders that need to be embedded in this to get us into that mindset of acting in accordance with what we want. But another reminder is basically that we are seeing, like you said, the best of everybody's lives. When you post that rooftop picture of lunch on the roof on a Wednesday, with this beautiful weather and a volcano in the background, I look at that and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. But I also know the other things that you go through to be there, what you've given up, the things that you have to deal with on a daily basis. So I know that it's not perfect, but somebody that doesn't know you doesn't necessarily get that whole story. And so that's another way that we can kind of instill that pause that we need to say, like, is this really something that I want? Because if I really want it, I'm willing to act towards it. Is kind of stepping back and saying, well, I'm not seeing the full story here. What am I missing? And how did this person get to that place?
Well, and I think it doesn't even, like, yes, there are tons of positives and there's tons of negatives about my life, for example, living abroad. It doesn't even have to be, you don't even have to look at it and be like, I'm not going to live in Guatemala because I have talked to Cristina and I know about the safety concerns and I know about this concern and that concern. It doesn't have to be you focusing on the negatives of my life. And I don't think you are, but it's also, you might just not want to live abroad. And maybe you don't want to speak Spanish. And maybe you don't want to go to salsa class. And maybe you don't really give a crap about volcanoes. And to be honest with you, I think they're really pretty to look at, but like, I've hiked one my whole time in Central America. But, I think it doesn't have to be necessarily you don't want to do it because there are negative aspects. It can be you don't want to do it because that's just not the life you want to lead.
Yeah, so that I think is like a super important point. And you make that in your blog post where it's kind of like, yeah, that lifestyle looks great, but I honestly just don't want it. And I'm not trying to pick on your situation in particular. Obviously, like, it's just a fantastic example. But pulling back and saying, what is it about what I'm saying I want? So, like, okay, I'm trying to think of how to word this. Like, I see, I think the example you use in your blog post is like this comfy laptop with coffee and like, this perfect nomadic lifestyle. I look at that and I'm like, well, I might not necessarily want to live in Guatemala and have these concerns. What is it about that appeals to me? So the freedom, the access to a new culture, like, there's different aspects of it, and that's actually what's appealing to me. And then looking at it and saying, how else can I get that? Because I don't necessarily want to uproot my life and pack up my stuff and and go on the road for 3 months. So that's another way to kind of pull back and say, well, that looks fantastic and I can appreciate that, but it's not okay just to be like, yes, I want that.
What elements of that do I like? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that we have a really good example of the way that I live abroad and the way that you travel abroad. We wrote about it during Location Independence Month, and we wrote about like our different stories and the definitions of digital nomad and location independent. But I think that's a perfect example of you doing what you want to do, which is not live abroad. It's to take time with your flexible business and take advantage of it in Australia and New Zealand.
Exactly. Yeah. So then, in that case, I do sometimes have that fleeting moment where I'm like, I should travel now. I should pick up and spend a couple months on the road because now's when I can. I don't have kids. Now I have a house and a mortgage and a husband and stuff. But I do like have those fleeting moments. But to me, it's and I'm gonna post that link to the post that you mentioned there. To me, it was looking at like, well, what is it exactly that I want about that? It's the inspiration you get from meeting new people. It's the independence you feel when you're just kind of uprooted and put in a new place and you have to learn to read signs that you would normally just walk past and communicate with people when, their first language is not the same as yours. It's those moments and then figuring out how I can still incorporate that in my life. So it does look different.
I get that a lot too. I'll like look at pictures of the beach and I'm like, oh, I just want to live at the beach. And then 2 seconds later, I'm like, no, I don't. I don't even like, I like a day at the beach, like 2 days at the beach, and then I'm over it. I'm like, I don't want to live at the beach. And so it's like that reality check, like checking yourself and being like, no, Cristina, it's not really what you want. You know that. I was going to go in a slightly different direction. I was just going to make sure we talk about the aspects of if you have decided this is really what you want, but you're still kind of being held back a little bit by whatever, your fear, your time, your priorities, any of that stuff, how you can really start bridging that gap. Do you have any immediate insights?
Well, I'm curious if you addressed that in the post.
I really am pulling it up. No, I basically said just do it. No, but next step, just do it. But I don't know. I know that you and I are both list people. And so I would say our immediate instinct would probably be, okay, write down how am I going to get from point A to point H? How am I going to get to the point where I can sustain myself while living abroad? What am I going to do with all my things? What am I going to sorry, I got distracted by the comments on the side. So many
things to be distracted by.
No, but just how am I going to bridge that gap? I'm just going to shut up and let you take over now.
I think you touched on it before about actually breaking things down and choosing that next best step. Helps eliminate or at least diminish the overwhelm that comes in approaching something big. And, we're talking about this in terms of like kind of life-changing, but this can be literally on a day-to-day basis where I can talk about the fact that, oh man, I wish I was somebody that meditated every day. And I can say that over and over again, but until I actually act on it, I'm not showing that it's really something that I want. And that's like the littlest thing, right? Because now it really is for me putting my headphones in, opening my Calm app, and for 5 minutes a day meditating. And that's all it took to actually start doing it. But for months, I just talked about it. So it doesn't have to be these huge changes. It's the little things on a daily basis that we say we want to be doing, but we're not necessarily making a space for them. And of course, that gets back to priorities. So, I think this is like the perfect time to talk about some of the stuff that we are covering in Solopreneur Sanity, our handbook that we actually just finished writing and sent off to the designer yesterday. Because so much of that is really tactics, mindset shifts, things you can do to get you past barriers and living the life you want, getting shit done, building the business you want. So tactics like breaking it down and choosing the next best step is the perfect example of how you can start actually acting in accordance with what you say you want.
Yeah. And I think, there's a lot of different questions, kind of little strategies and tactics that we use throughout the handbook. So spoiler, but one is, is this helpful? And one is, if I'm being honest with myself. And so we find that those threads are popping up everywhere. And we're like, yeah, being honest with yourself, pretty freaking important. And we'll help you with this, with Solopreneur Sanity, with all of it.
Yeah. So if anybody, I know we've had a couple of people join in the last few minutes. If anybody has any questions, our topic, because I know we've kind of jumped around a bit, but we're talking really about acting in accordance with what you say you want. And the fact that it's very easy to say we want something, but not necessarily align our actions with that. So if you do have any questions, just type a / and Q in the message box there, and it'll pop up nicely for us on the side here so we can answer them. In the meantime, I'm just going to pop a link in there for the post that we originally referenced in case anybody missed that. Cristina wrote that for our site last week.
I was just thinking of another example when you were saying it's not all huge life-changing things like deciding to move abroad. It could be something like, I want to feel more fit. So this is something that I used to struggle with a lot, and I feel like I really have a system that works for me now. But I felt for a long time that I was on this side of point A, where I was like complaining about it and saying I wanted it and not actually ever doing it. And so I have some ideas for how somebody could get to that point B of actually putting into action that they want to feel fit. But I'm curious if you have any like immediate first steps that you would tell someone who,
specifically in that situation. Start small. I mean, that is a huge, lofty goal. Totally. I just want to feel fit, and it's not specific by any means. So, getting out for a walk one day a week and just experiencing the feeling that you get when you start moving, but also looking at where it is you want to feel fit, because that could mean so many different things. For me, like the minute you said that, I'm like, well, I've got the working out down, but I say that I want to eat healthy. And I don't make the time to prepare meals or to actually grocery shop or do anything that would be required of somebody that wants to eat healthy. But for me, that would be what I mean by getting fit. So a lot of times it is just about putting more specifics around what we're saying. Yeah, that's a good call.
Putting parameters around it. And then I think I would say a good second or third or whatever step would be, okay, well, what's preventing you right now? Okay, like you just said, I don't make the time. Okay, well, if I feel like I don't have the time, what can I do that is really quick but still accomplishes my goal? Maybe I'm going to invest slightly more in getting, we mentioned this in Solopreneur Sanity, getting Blue Apron meals sent to my house. And that's kind of like, maybe eventually you're whipping up gourmet meals every single night because you've made it a priority and you've freed up the time. But in the interim, what are little steps that you can take to kind of get you slightly closer to that thing that you want?
Yeah. So like, for example, with specifically with this, I really like green smoothies. And while they cannot be my meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it's an easy step towards all I have to do is buy spinach, bananas, and big bags of frozen fruit. And I can make in one batch green smoothies for 3 days and easily grab them for lunch. So that's a really small step. And then when I actually start doing that, I realize, I'm actually having this healthy meal. I put a lot of protein powder in it, so that's what constitutes the meal. But I'm actually, I notice the difference when I actually do that, as opposed to having pasta for lunch and wanting to take a 3-hour nap after I do it. So starting with something small like that, where I just kind of found a green smoothie recipe and was like, this is something super easy. Yeah. I can make a bunch at once and I can just grab it out of the fridge and drink it. It's ready to go. But that also inspires me to take further
always
action.
The snowball effect. Yeah, and for me, like when I was like, I want to work out more consistently. It could be, I don't have time. Okay, well, I can do a 30-minute HIIT workout, and I can't really justify not having 30 minutes because that's ridiculous. I am too tired. Okay, well, I know reasonably if I work out, I'll probably have more energy. So maybe at the time I know have the most energy, that's when I decide I'm going to plan my workout for. Maybe it's I forget. So I put a bag of all my gym clothes right by the door. And so there's all those little steps. But
yep. Yeah, I love that. Making it as easy as possible.
Lower the barrier to entry. So we have a question over in the chat. What do you do when you really when you realize you aren't acting in accordance with what you want? Do you change what you want, or do you act on it? And that is a great question, and a complicated one, because that kind of goes through all the steps that we're talking about. Is if you really, really want this thing and you for sure want it and you're not acting on it, my easy advice would be, well, start acting on it. That's obviously super oversimplified. And then do you change what you want? If you're willing to change what you want, it might be that you didn't actually want that thing so much in the first place. But Sarah, what is your reaction to that?
Yeah, so I think, there's polar opposite answers, so that, and they're the way we're going to talk about it is super simplified, like you said. It's something that you want, you've confirmed that you want it, do it, act in accordance with it. Now, if it's, of course, the first example I think of is from Thrive, which we reference all the time, Ariana Huffington's book, where for years she said she wanted to learn German. And all of a sudden, when it's on her list and she's not exactly sure why. And so she dropped it. So there's always the option of, if you realize that you have just said you wanted something for so long, but you're not actually attaching any real emotional value or willing to invest in it, then there is the option of just kind of crossing it off the list and not feeling bad about that.
Right.
So that's kind of the opposite of the other simplified solution.
Right. Do it or drop it. No. So your example is someone who says they want a new job. And so my further response to that would be, it's not just, I want a new job, therefore I'm going to get a new job. There's a ton of steps in between that, right? Like I'm going to start going to a networking event. I'm going to learn more about the industry I say I'm interested in. I'm going to have some informational interviews to, see what the average day in a life of someone in this job is like. I am going to think about what I don't like in my current job and see if I can negotiate with my boss. And so she says, yes, love it. Yay. And so I think again, we want to simplify because that's easy, but then it's a huge multi-step process for any decision you go through, right? Right. So I'm just curious if that answered your question, but again, it varies a lot.
Yeah. So I think that, what we would say is that first step, once you've realized that you aren't acting in accordance with what you want or what you say you want, is pulling back and questioning whether or not you really want it. That's your first step.
Yeah.
And this can help you make that decision, or it can be the next step after you've confirmed you want it, is kind of breaking it down and making it realistic. So what's it going to take to actually make it happen? Yeah. And only then can you actually take action.
Right.
So, and within each of those, there's way more that goes into it, but that's kind of the basic idea of how you would approach something.
Right. Well, and I think to add in, there's also the option of asking yourself, do I really want this? And saying, I don't know, but how am I going to figure it out? What's it going to take to help me figure out and make this decision? And again, that's where like all those little interim steps, those baby steps come in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question.
Yeah, it's an awesome question. Cool. More to add, Sarah?
No, I mean, I think that's, kind of where we're going with it. And we do, like we said, we share a ton in the Solopreneur Sanity Handbook about actually taking action when you're stalled or when you don't know what the next step is. But we just want to kind of encourage you to stop, pause, and question whether it's something you really want, and then act in accordance with it.
Yeah. Good final line. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We will not be here next Wednesday because I will be flying. Sarah, you'll be
holiday brunching.
Excellent. I will be drugged on my flight and you will be eating all of the food.
Yes, it's going to be great. But yeah, thank you all for being here today. And we'll be back. Our standard time is Wednesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye. Bye.